first. That's quite an act to follow. I'll see what I can manage. There's been some really wonderful work in recent years at the intersection of psychology and trauma studies in particular, and biblical scholarship. And your comments are, I think, a welcome addition to that. Your choice of the Hagar tradition in particular, I think, points towards some of the significant theological issues that thinking about the biblical traditions from a trauma-informed perspective raises for us. And so as a response and as a contribution to this conversation, I'd like to offer a brief discussion of the book of Jeremiah, and through that to bring our attention to some of the questions that are raised by these texts when we recognize them as depictions of traumatic experiences and as literature affected by the traumatic experiences of both their authors and their audiences. Now, how many of you have sat down and actually tried to read the book of Jeremiah? Past just chapter 29, verse 11. Okay. So if you have tried to sit down and read Jeremiah from beginning to end, you will know that it is a very odd book. It is not the kind of book that you would go into the library or into the bookstore and pull off that has a nice, neat beginning and middle and an end. It starts with some poetry that condemns the Israelites for abandoning God, but then halfway through that, there is suddenly this detour to make a long sermon about all the things going wrong at the temple. And then there's some more poetry, which seems to be Jeremiah expressing his frustration at God over the impossibility of the task that God has set him. But that also keeps getting interrupted by narrative pieces of stories that seem to tell about certain episodes in the life of the prophet. And the whole book goes on like this: some poetry, some prose, some oracles addressed to the people, some stories about the prophet, some stories about Judah's kings, and it's all put together in a fashion that's extremely difficult to make heads or tails of, because it's not in a nice, neat chronological order. It doesn't follow a topical or thematic structure. And if that wasn't confusing enough, there are, in fact, as some of my students in this room will already know, two versions of the book of Jeremiah. There is a Hebrew version that is the basis for your modern translations, but then there is also a different and slightly shorter Greek version. It was probably circulating in antiquity as well. There's been a lot of effort put into trying to make sense of what is going on in this confused book. And one of the most compelling recent suggestions draws on the work particularly of Kathleen O'Connor, looking into the research on the ways that people respond to traumatic events. One of the first and most common things that happens after a traumatic event, as many of you in this room will know, is that survivors struggle to find the words to talk about what has happened. Okay? And sometimes their memories are fragmentary, and what they can remember doesn't join up into a nice, neat narrative in the way that our normal memories do. So when the book of Jeremiah jumps around, when it starts from one subject, skips to another, when it starts a story in the reign of one king, and then suddenly skips back several decades to tell a story that happened in the reign of another king, when it says one thing and then says something else that doesn't seem to go with it, it's speaking in a way that resonates with the experiences of traumatized people. The book struggles to tell a coherent story about what has happened to the people because the people aren't sure if there is a coherent story to be told. And again, in this book, we hear people asking, why? Why has the Lord our God done these things to us? In chapter 5. So the book of Jeremiah searches for answers to these questions. It is, in its whole, an extended act of meaning-making. It is searching for order in the face of chaos. And as it begins to guide the people out of the mess in which they find themselves, the book does something both fascinating and quite strange. It makes us pay attention to the prophet himself. Now, this is quite easy for us to miss because we live in a biographical culture in which we're very accustomed to our politicians and our celebrities and our pastors having all of their narrative their story, their personal lives, spilt all over the front pages. But in the biblical text, and particularly with the prophets, this is really quite unique. And the book doesn't just tell us about Jeremiah's career. It does something more specific. It links Jeremiah's experience to the people more widely. So Jeremiah suffers because the people suffer. And when the people are besieged in the city, Jeremiah is besieged in the city. When the people are forced from their homes and flee to a foreign land, Jeremiah goes with them. Jeremiah bears witness for his people. So when the book focuses so much on Jeremiah's personal life, what it seems to be doing is trying to use Jeremiah's life to make sense of everyone else's. If it is possible to tell a coherent story about Jeremiah's life, then perhaps it is possible to tell a coherent story about what has happened to us, the people. And so in the midst of this disorder, this upheaval, this chaos, the book asks this question: how do the survivors of these traumatic events tell their story? The Israelites' story is rooted in the confession that the Lord our God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, delivered them from slavery, brought them to the promised land. But the people that Jeremiah is speaking to have been banished from the land. So how do they tell their story? The set is broken, half the players are missing, and the divine playwright appears to have left the building. It's no wonder that the book of Jeremiah looks like an opening night train wreck. And yet each time the book threatens to go off the rails, what it does is it circles back to the prophet, to his life, to his relationship with God, and to his relationship with God's people. And in these glimpses of Jeremiah's life, the fractured and the fragmented story of God and his people begins to be told anew. And this is not, and it cannot be the same story that they told before, but neither is it irreparable chaos. And so we're told in chapter 16 that the days are coming when it shall no longer be said, as the Lord lives who brought the people of Israel up out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives who brought the people of Israel up out of the land of the north and out of all of the lands where he had driven them. Jeremiah's suffering is the linchpin of this story. His suffering reflects and represents the suffering of the people of which he is a part. This human propensity for storytelling is one of our most universal characteristics. And the Bible is the exemplar par excellence. Even its non-narrative portions, the law and the prophets, are presented and are set within and are understood as part of the story of God's relationship with humanity. And indeed, just as critical to making sense of Jeremiah's story is that the other person Jeremiah suffers with is God. So at the end of chapter 8, we read an expression of utter agony and despair. Oh, that my head were a spring of water, my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep in day and night for the slain of my poor people. Your tears are prayers. Now, depending on the edition of the Bible you have, it may tell you that this is Jeremiah speaking, or it might tell you that it's God speaking. And the reason that it's uncertain is that it could be either. When Jeremiah suffers, when the people around him try to break him down, try to deny him his witness, God suffers. One of the most powerful words of this book is that we never suffer alone. Even in the deepest moments of despair, when it seems as though we are utterly alone and everything is lost, this book witnesses that God suffers with us. No matter how angry Jeremiah gets, no matter how much he laments or he curses at God, God will not abandon him. Now, as you've heard, a number of the students in the audience today are in my prophetic responses to trauma class this quarter. And as we have read Jeremiah, and we've read some of these scholarly work informed by trauma, we've recognized that its chaotic structure and its multiplicity of voices is a response and reflects the book's traumatic origins. And in the process, we've been able to recognize that the book comes out as a powerful resource for thinking about and responding to contemporary traumas. Scripture's acknowledgement of trauma, its willingness to just sit in the messiness and the disorderliness that is the aftermath of trauma, is liberating. God no more expects us to have it all together than God expected Jeremiah to have it all together. And God has space, not just for Jeremiah's anger, but for our anger. No need to plaster on that church smile, as you said yesterday. But this has also raised some really significant questions, and I'd like to pose them to you as someone steeped both in the psychological and the theological traditions. So one is that the book of Jeremiah contains this chorus of competing voices, competing narratives that offer a variety of interpretations of what has happened and why it has happened. So some passages, for example, suggest that there is hope for those left behind in the land, whilst others cut off that possibility. Thinking even just a little bit more broadly, the book of Ezekiel offers a very different kind of response to essentially the same traumatic experiences, whereas Jeremiah offers a very disorderly, very chaotic stage of response. Ezekiel offers a very orderly, very precise, very organized way of handling this experience. So what does this kind of polyphony, this variety of responses, have to say about the nature of Scripture? And the book also contains a prominent streak of what Daniel Smith Christopher refers to as our fault theology, so a form of self-blaming. So explanations for the disaster that place moral responsibility on the victims. Now, such explanations can be a way of reclaiming agency, and so they can be constructive, but they can also be highly problematic. So from a psychological perspective, where is that line? And do we see it in Scripture? And complicating matters even further is that in much of Jeremiah, it is God who is the perpetrator. What do we do with that? I'm put in mind of Kathleen O'Connor's comment that victims need interpretations to survive, even bad ones, false ones, even partial ones, or self-blaming ones. So how do we reckon with the possibility that some of the interpretations that are offered by the biblical text might be bad or false or partial or self-blaming, even at the same time that they are part of the life-giving word? So your discussion of Hagar points to a similar problematic, I think. How do we grapple with a sacred text that depicts the ancestors of the faith as abusing the vulnerable and the marginalized, without declaring that behavior to be normative, short of simply abandoning the text? So thank you again for your lecture. I look forward to your thoughts and to our further conversation.